Hello, my name is Nathan LeMaster. I serve as a professor of Old Testament at the Master's Seminary. And I love studying the Old Testament. I love understanding how God has communicated to us in the Old Testament in particular. Doesn't mean I don't read the New Testament, but I pay a special attention to the Old Testament and love to study it. I'm excited that you're delving into the book of Judges. Not an easy book to study, but a rewarding book to study. And I'm excited to hear that. You don't often see or you don't often hear of studies or Bible studies or even pastors who are preaching through the book of Judges. And it's a helpful study. It's a necessary study. All the Word of God is inspired and is profitable for us. So as I myself have studied the book of Judges previously and have spent some considerable time within the book, I've come to see the benefits of studying the book. So I'm very excited to see that you're studying the book of Judges this semester and encourage you to spend time delving into this book. Some books of the Bible are more difficult to study than others. Lamentations would be one example of that. It's a very difficult book to read. It's not because it's not God's word or it's not important, but it's just difficult, honestly, to read through. Judges is probably at the top of that list of difficult books to read. There's a lot of content within Judges that is hard to understand. It's a different world than what we live in currently. We don't see the things that we read about in Judges today, at least not on a wide scale. So it can be very difficult for us to put ourselves into a position in understanding the book of Judges itself. What is it trying to convey? What is it trying to argue? How does it speak to us about God's character, who God is, what he's doing with Israel at the time? So Judges itself, it is a difficult book to study. I mean, I would highlight especially Judges 17 through 21. This might be one of the most difficult passages in all of the Old Testament. Just in terms of reading the passage, seeing what's going on, the horrible things that are happening in those chapters, it's a difficult book to study. Just at the outset, when we want to introduce and think about the book of Judges, how do we interpret the book? How do we glean what we need to from the book? The first thing we need to recognize is that it is a difficult book to study. It's also a tragic book to study. And this comes out certainly within the Judges themselves. You see characters that come into focus throughout the book of Judges, and it seems as though they kind of get, or they go from bad to worse. So Gideon, it starts out in a kind of in a helpless way, and we start to see him do good things and even great things for God. And by the time we get to the end of Gideon's life, it's a sad state of affairs. Jephthah, as one of the other judges, a difficult character to study. He makes a vow, a rash vow that ends tragically. Samson, it's just kind of character after character that are quite tragic in the book. But I also want us to think about Judges in terms of its relevancy to today. This is a relevant book. It's a difficult book to read. It's a difficult book to study. There's many instances within the book that are quite tragic, but this is a relevant book for us to understand. This is an important book for us to understand. There are many, many contemporary parallels. I mentioned before that it can be difficult for us to jump back into the culture of the book of Judges at that time. What exactly was going on? What were the wars like? What were the issues like in the book? It can be difficult for us to understand that. But when we look at human nature and we look at the way that the nature of humanity really is on display in the book of Judges, we see a whole host of parallels to our own time. One of the key phrases, if not maybe the key phrase of the book of Judges, is the phrase that everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. There is maybe not a more parallel statement to today than that. Look around us today and we see what's going on in culture. We see what's happening in our own world. And everyone did what was right in their own eyes is a vivid description of exactly what's going on today as well. So this is a relevant book to study. It's not an easy book to study, but it's a very relevant book to study. I would also say that this is a rewarding book to study. The contrast is between God's faithfulness and the wickedness of humanity. Mankind is on display as being incredibly wicked, doing horrible things to each other, causing a whole host of problems, rebelling against God. But in the midst of all of that, God's grace is really on display in the midst of this wicked people and a whole host of nations that are wicked people. And so this is a relevant book to study, and it's a rewarding book to study for us as well. Let's set a little bit of the context as we think about the introduction of Judges. What is the book? When was it written? Who wrote it even? I want to set a little bit of context to help us understand what was going on at the time. So let's first talk about when the book was written, or when we think it is written. Because when a book is written is going to help us understand why it was written. And therefore, it's going to help us understand the content that was included in the book. So if you remember back to David's reign, King David started his reign around 1011 BC, 1011 BC. And he ruled over Judah only for 7 years. Right? He didn't rule over all of Israel to begin with. He only ruled over Judah, and he ruled over Judah for 7 years. And then after that 7-year period, he became the king over all Israel. And he reigned 33 years as king over all of Israel, eventually dying in 971 BC. Now, before David comes to reign over the entirety of Israel, there's civil war that happens within Israel. There's a question about, should the kingdom go to Saul's descendants? Should it go to David? Should it go to someone else? So there is a civil war that takes place amongst the tribes. You can take a look at 2 Samuel chapter 2 to see that civil war, or some description about that war that happens. Now, tradition for the book of Judges, tradition has it that the prophet Samuel is the author of the Judges, or is the author of the book of Judges, and he writes during this period of civil war. And the reason why he writes during the period of this civil war is because he wants Israel to understand what exactly does it mean that God is their true ruler. God delegates authority and he delegates rulership. He had Samuel anoint David as king, but there's still many within Israel that are not following after David as the king that God has anointed or that God has appointed. And so because of that, Samuel writes the book of Judges, and he wants Israel to understand in their current situation, let's say in the civil war in which they're in their current situation, Samuel wants them to understand that they can't try to rule on their own. They have to understand God is their true ruler, and God appoints a king or appoints a ruler as he sees fit. And so this brings us back to everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Samuel, in the time of writing the Judges, he's writing a history book, and he's pointing back to Israel's history. And he says, look back at this time in Israel's history where everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And Samuel is trying to teach Israel at the current time, during this period in which David is coming to power, that we can't replicate that period of time. We know how that ended. We know the horrible things that happened in that period of time, and we don't want to duplicate that. We don't want to do that again. So he writes this history book, the book of Judges, in order to help Israel at the current time, which is when David is coming to power, to help Israel understand the ramifications of not following after God. Let's take a look at Joshua chapter 24. Now, this is kind of the bridge between Joshua, Judges, Joshua chapter 24. Now, this is verse 15. This is a very well-known verse. Joshua is speaking. And in verse 15, he says, "And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your father served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Okay, we will serve Yahweh. So Joshua sets this up. And as an example to all the people, Joshua says, take a look at my example. I want to follow after God. I am choosing this day, I will follow after God. I'll follow after Yahweh. Because Israel is in a very delicate position. They come up out of Egypt. They had Moses, who was the great leader of Israel, leading them through the desert, acting on behalf for them with God, acting as a mediator on their behalf. Joshua comes in and takes over after Moses, and Joshua goes in to conquer the land, and there's forward progress. There's all sorts of things that Joshua accomplishes, and he acts as a godly leader. And then Joshua is passing away. Joshua recognizes this, and he says, there's no one who's going to take my same position. There's no one who's going to take my same place. And so he puts it on the people. He puts it on the individuals, and he says, all right, take a look at my example. Choose this day whom you're going to serve. As for me and my house, we're going to serve Yahweh. You, as a family, as an individual, as a group, as a tribe, as an entire nation, need to make the decision who you're going to serve. Now, unfortunately, in Israel's history, we see the direction that they go. We see the direction that they go, and Samuel, in writing Judges, is trying to warn the people. We can't do that again. We can't go back to this period where everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So Samuel writes the book. We think Samuel writes Judges in the period of David, as David is coming to power. Now let's take a look at the time frame, or the events, the history of the Judges. What are the things, the historical events that are recorded within the book of Judges? And this is important for us to understand, because Samuel curates the stories that he includes in Judges. He curates them and he organizes them in a particular way. And it's not chronological. Samuel is not trying to tell all of the events from this period. He's not trying to start with Othniel, who's understood to be the first judge, and go all the way through chronologically until we get to Samuel's time period. Samuel is selective in who he includes in the book and who he talks about in Judges. He's very selective, and he even changes the chronology of the book, the time frame. He switches it up a little bit, because the way that the book is organized, he basically wants to go from bad to worse. And the flow and the movement of the book, the organization of the book, is to start with not bad in the sense of everything was going wrong, but that period where Joshua says, choose who you're going to serve. This crux point in Israel's history. We start there and we just go worse, 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 all the way down the line. So Samuel is not trying to tell or not trying to recount the book of Judges entirely chronologically. The structure of the book is really from bad to worse. So as we go through the book and as you study through the book of Judges, just recognize that things are going to start poorly and they're going to get worse and worse and worse. Really the climax, or I should say, not even the climax, the most horrible portion of reading in Judges is going to be chapter 17 through 21. You read chapter 17 through 21 and you say, how can people do this to each other? How can people be so perverse and in rebellion against God? And the history of Israel is on display. The nature of humanity without following God is on display. So the time frame, if we just look at the chronology of Judges, the time frame of the book of Judges, it starts with the death of Joshua, which we think is about 1390 BC. Okay, 1390 BC would be the death of Joshua, right around there. And it goes all the way to the death of Samson. Now, again, Samson is not the last judge to be mentioned or the last story to be told in the book of Judges. But chronologically, Samson dies, we think, around 1050, 1055 BC, somewhere in there. Okay, so we have a period of several centuries of history that's being told, and the history that's being told is a downward spiral. I'll give one example, that what I mentioned before, chapter 17 through 21. The reason why we think that chapter 17 through 21 actually took place chronologically before Samson is because of the relocation of the tribe of Dan. One of the central aspects of that section, chapter 17 through 21, is that the tribe of Dan is relocating. They're relocating from the south, which is the land that God gave to them. And they said, we don't want this land, we're going to move. And they move all the way up into the north of Israel. That actually occurred quite early on. It occurred fairly soon after Joshua died. The judges, there's 12 judges in total that are mentioned. And some of the judges are given a very small little snippet in the book. An example would be someone like Shamgar. Shamgar is mentioned as a judge, but there's only a couple of sentences that are given in terms of description for him as a judge. So there's very important judges that are much more is described of them. They're the story that they have, all sorts of things told about them. But we have 12 judges in total that are mentioned in the book. Now, it is important also to recognize that there are more than 12 judges. We know that Eli, the priest, is considered a judge. Samuel himself is considered a judge. In fact, we might consider Samuel, the prophet, to be the very last judge. Right? He anoints Saul. He anoints David. The monarchy comes to fruition within Israel. And Samuel himself is really, let's say, the last judge of Israel. He doesn't mention himself within the book of Judges, but do recognize that there are more than just these 12 judges. How many, we're not exactly sure. But at least Samuel mentions these 12 judges, and he organizes them again, in a sense, from bad to worse. Othniel is the first one that's mentioned. Othniel is not a bad judge. Maybe bad is not the right term to use, from bad to worse. Othniel is not a bad judge. He accomplishes, he's a warrior. He accomplishes some things within warfare. Nothing much is said about his character, or not a lot is said about him directing Israel ethically or anything like that. It's just he was a warrior. Ehud, another example. Ehud, of course, with a left-handed man who makes a sword, and you'll be reading more of that story, of course. Ehud, there's not a lot of negative things that's said about Ehud. You have Shamgar mentioned as well. Deborah and Barak is a very interesting story. They're fighting against Sisera. Deborah and Barak, both as judges. You have Gideon, and Gideon, a great deal is said about Gideon. Some positive things to begin with. He's kind of a weak character that's put on display. He doesn't really trust God as he should, but God uses him to accomplish some amazing things against the Midianites in deliverance of Israel. But Gideon does not end well. Gideon does not, as a judge, we really start to see this downgrade within the judges, not just within Israel. Israel is seen as being on a slippery slope. They're sliding down. They're descending down into wickedness. Some of the judges are seen as, maybe trying to help Israel out of those things, but by the time we get to the end, those such as Gideon, Jephthah, Samson, when we get to Samson in particular, they're not helping Israel be better Yahweh followers. They're not helping Israel to understand God in a better way. They're not helpful in that way. In a sense, they're sliding down just as Israel is sliding into wickedness. So a lot is said about Gideon. There's Tola, who's mentioned as well, a very short snippet about Tola. Jair is also mentioned. Jephthah, there's a lengthy story about Jephthah and him sacrificing his daughter. There's a question about, did he actually sacrifice his daughter? Did he not? When we get to that section, of course, we'll be examining that. Ibzan, Elon, Abdon, 3 judges mentioned in succession. Not much is said about them. Samson, being the last judge that's mentioned, and Samson certainly not a good character, not a positive character. So the organization of the book seems to show the judges becoming worse and worse. And I mentioned before that Eli the priest that we come into contact with or comes into view in 1 Samuel, Eli is considered a judge. And if you read about his 2 sons, 1 Samuel chapter 2, verses 12 and following, if you read about his 2 sons, you just see the horrible state that Israel is in. Eli will not stand up against his 2 wicked sons. His 2 wicked sons are serving as priests. Their names are Hophni and Phinehas in 1 Samuel 2. And they're just getting worse and worse. And the wickedness of these judges even comes into the book of Samuel, and we see it with Hophni and Phinehas as well. Let's talk about the theology of the book. If this is the background, if this is the setting, we have Samuel writing Judges at a particular point in time during a civil war when David is coming to power. And he's trying to warn Israel that we can't just do what's right in our own eyes. Not everybody can just choose which way they want to go. We have to follow after God. We have to view God as being the true ruler of Israel. And so Samuel writes the book of Judges and says, as a negative example, look at these centuries of history. Let's call it the dark ages of Israel's history. Okay, the dark ages of Israel's history says, let's write, or I'm going to write a history of these dark ages and show how wicked that Israel got. Because everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So Samuel is arguing against that. He's saying we can't go back to that. He's giving as negative an example as he can to show the people what happens when they go against Yahweh's leadership. But not all of Judges is bleak. Not all of Judges is negative and horrible, because God is in Judges. And we see God's character put on display in the book. As you read these cycles within the book, you see that the people fell into wickedness. God sends a nation against them or a group against them and subjugates them. The people cry out and they say, we're in bondage. We have to be delivered. We repent. And then God sends a judge to deliver his people. It's similar to Egypt in that sense, where Israel was in Egypt. They're in bondage in Egypt. They're subjugated under a nation, and they cry out to God. And they're in Egypt for 430 years. They cry out to God, and God sends Moses, the deliverer, to bring them up out of Egypt. So in Judges, this happens again and again and again and again. So we see that God is not giving up on his people. I'll come back to that theme in just a little bit, because that is a central focus of God's character, of what he's doing and how he's interacting with Israel within the book of Judges. The other thing that we need to notice and that we recognize from the outset of the book of Judges is the true nature of humanity. The people keep showing their true colors. The people keep showing their rebellion. They say, oh, we repent. We're so sorry that we fell into idolatry. We're so sorry that we fell into wickedness. And when those external circumstances come upon them, when that external pressure comes upon them and they're subjugated, then they cry out to God. When things are going good, they pay no attention to God. When things are going well for them, they have no need of God according to their own thinking. Say, we don't need God. We're fine. We're doing okay. And then they start to descend into wickedness. And then God sends an oppressor against them. And then they realize, we can't get ourselves out of this situation. So they cry out to God. And they cry out to God, and God delivers them again and again and again. But it shows the true nature of humanity. Those who are not true followers of God, who are not true fearers of God, they think of God as a get-out-of-jail-free card. They think of God as a genie who can do something for them. When the pressure comes on, when the problems come and the issues come into life, then they cry out and they say, oh, God, deliver me, help me, save me. But if God does such, they go right back to what they were doing beforehand. When things are easy, the people go towards wickedness. When things are hard, they cry out to God, God delivers them, and he does so every single time. Every single time God delivers Israel. So you might ask, why doesn't God get fed up with this? Why doesn't he get tired of this? He knows exactly what the people are going to do. He knows exactly that once he sends this nation against them, then they're going to give this, in a sense, false repentance. They're going to turn back to God because of the external pressure. And they're going to cry out and say, God, we'll follow you. We'll truly follow you. We will. This time we will. And God knows that once he delivers them and things are going okay, they're just going to fall right back into wickedness. So God knows this. So the question, the conundrum in the book, the difficulty within the book is, Us seeing this pattern happen again and again and again within Judges, and we ask, well, why is God dealing with Israel in this way? Why does he keep delivering them? Why does he keep saving them? And it all comes back to God's character. It all comes back to who God is, his faithfulness. His faithfulness is on display. He will always continue to work with his people because he promised that's what he would do. God never goes back on his promises. He never breaks his promises. If he promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that he will work with Israel and bless Israel, that's exactly what he's going to do. Even in their, let's call them the dark ages within Israel's history. So the people are on display. The true nature of humanity is on display. And one thing to notice in the book is that the judges themselves get worse and worse. Othniel, the first judge, he's not depicted as being a horrible person, a bad person. He doesn't really do anything wrong at all within the book. But by the time we get to someone like Jephthah apparently offers his own daughter as a sacrifice. And we say, how can that be? Why would that be? It's because of the twistedness, the perversion, the wrong thinking, the wrong theology, the wrong understanding of who God is, the perversion that occurs within Israel. These are not positive examples. Gideon, he builds an altar, or builds an idol, right? He just got done smashing all of the idols of his tribe, and he himself makes something that turns into an idol that the people, or that corrupts the people. Think of Samson. Samson, he's almost entirely devoid of godly character. Almost entirely devoid of godly character. There is so little that is said about Samson in a positive way. He has no self-control. He has no gumption. He has no following after God. He has really no redeeming godly character. And it just gets worse and worse. Of course, as I mentioned already, the culmination that Judges chapter 17 through 21, especially chapters 19 through 21. And that is the culmination statement that Samuel is making. What happened when everyone did what was right in their own eyes? Israel became like Sodom and Gomorrah. Judges 19 through 21 is a clear contrast with Sodom and Gomorrah. When you read the two stories side by side, the story of Judges 19 through 21 is to tell you that Israel has become worse than Sodom and Gomorrah. And remember, that period, that Judges 17 through 21, is early chronologically within Judges. It's the last thing or the last story that's mentioned within the book, but chronologically, it's quite early within the book. So it doesn't take long for Israel after the death of Joshua to spiral down to be worse even than Sodom and Gomorrah. One other thing, or just a couple other things to bear in mind, the small decisions that are made. We ask the question, how can Israel become so wicked? How can it be that they come out of this pinnacle period of conquering the land, crossing the Jordan River, miracles that happen while they're conquering the land? How is it that they can go from that to Judges 19 through 21? How is that the case? It's small decisions that they made at the beginning. As we study through the book of Judges, pay attention to those really small decisions that they make at the beginning that lead to wickedness to come. Judges chapter 1, verses 27 through 36. Pay attention especially to that section. Judges 1, 27 through 36. They did not drive out these people. It says that they conquered. They were supposed to go in and conquer. God gave them commands to say, you are to do this, this, and this as you conquer the land. As you take possession of the land, you're to dispossess these nations. You're going to get rid of them. Don't let them influence you. And Judges chapter 1, verses 27 through 36, they did not drive them out. They didn't drive them out. They made a compromise. They made a small compromise, which turned into a big compromise, which turned into a really big compromise, which turned into Judges 19 through 21. So we can see the corrupting nature of sin. Starts small and goes quite large. The light in the book, of course, is the grace of God to continue to work with his people, as I mentioned before. As you go all the way through Judges, pay special attention to this. And you get to Judges 19 through 21, and you'll say, how can this happen? But pay attention to the grace that God still extends for Israel in chapter 21. The people almost annihilate the tribe of Benjamin. It's almost gone. And through conniving and wickedness and deceit and treachery and problems, they preserve the tribe of Benjamin. And everyone who's reading the books should say, just wipe them out, like get rid of them. Why do we want this tribe of Benjamin? Wipe them out, get rid of them. But God keeps his promises. God keeps his promises. So even at the height of the wickedness of Israel, the grace of God is on display that he is faithful. He keeps his promises. Judges chapter 21, he preserves the tribe of Benjamin, a wicked tribe that should have been wiped out. And God said, I keep my promises. I'm faithful. Pay special attention to those things within the book of Judges. Again, it's a difficult book. It's a challenging book to read, but it's a rewarding book to read.